Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And check out our website at www.acwandukhistory.com for updates, podcasts, blog posts, and links to all of our social media pages. And also, this is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is author and historian Mike Somerville. Welcome, Mike.
Good afternoon, Des. Great to be with you.
Thank you. And of course, we're going to be talking about Sherwood Foresters today, which Mike has written 2 books, which we will get onto at the end of the podcast. Okay, Mike, so who were the Sherwood Foresters?
So the Sherwood Foresters are what we call a county regiment in the British Army. They are what used to be the old infantry regiments of the Rhine. And in the 1880s, these were reorganised onto a regional basis. And the Sherwood Foresters are the county regiment for Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. Quite a nice bit of name recognition there because everybody knows Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest. So although they're not the oldest regiment in the British Army, they're quite popular, and they had quite a good record for recruitment and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, we're gonna delve into their World War II story, but they had been involved in a couple of the wars before World War II, hadn't they? So they was involved in the Boer War, I believe, and also World War One. Yes.
Yeah, so very briefly, they're formed as long ago as the original regiment was the 45th Regiment of Foot, which was formed in 1741, I think. They fought in Quebec. They fought in the American War of Independence, Napoleonic Wars, Crimean War, and yes, then the Boer War and the First World War. 140,000 men in the First World War, 33 battalions, staggering numbers, really.
Okay, so how did the British regimental system work, and how is it different from our US counterparts as far as regiments and battalions are concerned?
Yeah, so I guess you have a lot of American listeners, and both America and also European armies. A regiment is actually a combat formation. That's not quite the same in the British Army. The regiment is very much an organizational thing. And in a US regiment, which is a Second World War regiment, you will have 3 battalions within the regiment. Now, as I just said, in the First World War, the Sherwood Foresters raised 33 battalions. They don't all fight together. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But as I say, the battalion is really the combat unit in the British Army, and you get battalions are grouped together in brigades, but those brigades aren't always from the same regiment. And the regiments and the battalions in a regiment are also very different in their nature. So you always have, in a county regiment, you have 2 regular battalions, which are permanent battalions. But you then have territorial battalions. So this, for American listeners, those are sort of the equivalent of National Guard. They're the reserve units, and they're regionally based. And then during the war, you also get wartime battalions are raised, additional wartime battalions are raised just for the duration of the hostilities. And you also get things like training battalions and home guard battalions. So a wide variety of different characters and different personnel within the same regiment because of this variety of different battalion types.
Okay, why did you become interested in particular, Mike, in the Sherwood Foresters and the 2nd and the 5th Battalion in particular?
2nd, 5th Battalion. It's
Yeah,
a
sorry,
single
2nd,
battalion.
5th Battalion. Yeah, apologies.
So in a sense, it's a purely random interest, but it's a random interest which was put on me by an unknown person in an infantry replacement depot somewhere in Italy in September, October 1943. Because when my father arrived in Italy, this chap decided that he was going to go as a replacement to the Sherwood Forest, the second. Well, by then they were actually the 5th Sherwood Foresters, but it was what was originally formed as the 2nd, 5th Sherwood Foresters in 1939. They'd suffered horrendous casualties in the 2 months since they landed in Italy, and my father was sent to replacement. So back in 2011, I got my father's war record, and I thought, this is interesting. I'll find out what his battalion did. And what I discovered was it was very difficult to find that out, because there's very little reference to the battalion in most of the histories. And I'm sure we'll talk on a little bit further about why some of the campaigns they fought in are mostly forgotten in British military history.
Okay. And is that something your father ever spoke to you about, his war experiences?
My father features very little in the book. It is not the story of my father, it's the story of the battalion,
Hmm.
and how the battalion changes as the war goes on, particularly partly as a result of casualties, partly as a result of the nature of the war. No, it's I've in the course of my research, I've spoken to a lot of descendants of the battalions and met some of them. Some of them have communicated through email. Quite a lot of them have even sent me their own research into their own ancestors' history, whether it be fathers or grandfathers. And the overwhelming story is that veterans do not talk about their experiences, particularly to family members in some respects. Um, they talk to their comrades, um, but it was very difficult, I think. And some of the stories I tell when I talk about this, I think that people who did not go through it, I think it was very difficult for them to understand the experiences, and I think it was very difficult for people to talk about their experiences to people who had not experienced combat and some of the deprivations which they went through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, but having that family connection, that must have been obviously I know you wanted to learn about the regiment and the battalion and everything, but having that family connection, I suppose, is quite
Yeah,
quite a nice thing, isn't it?
it's the reason that this is the battalion I studied. So yeah, that family connection is important in that respect. But equally, again, because I've got in touch with all these other people, I've become very emotionally attached to complete strangers who nevertheless went through the same thing that my father went through. And there's some extraordinary stories. There really are some incredible stories of courage and suffering as well.
Hmm. Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So anyway, okay, let's. So where were the Sherwood Foresters when war broke out in 1939, Mike?
Okay, so as we said, there's different battalions of the Sherwood Foresters. So the two regular battalions, one of them was actually in the Middle East, in Palestine, and the other one was in the UK. The two territorial battalions, which, as I say, are these reserve battalions, um, they were in March 1939 when Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. The British government responds by doubling the size of the territorial army. And what happens is that the existing battalions, which is the 5th Battalion in Derbyshire and the 8th Battalion in Nottinghamshire, are split into two. So that's why you get the second fifth. So that explains that bit. And they're still in the UK. Those territorial battalions. The second Sherwood Foresters go very quickly to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. The first fifth battalion follow them quite quickly in November, but they go as a line of communication troops. They don't go to the front line. And then the other three battalions stay in the UK until 1940. The 8th Battalion, which is the Nottinghamshire unit, the Nottinghamshire territorials, they go to Norway in 1940. They're the first unit to actually see action. But if I don't know how many of your listeners know much about the Norway campaign, but it's fought in April, May 1940. The Germans invade Norway with considerable air superiority. They take most of the airfields in Norway. So the British and the French and the Poles are also there. They're always fighting, to try and catch up, if you like. And the Sherwood Foresters, they do fight, but they're up against trained German mountain troops, and unfortunately, they get a pretty bloody nose, and they're forced to retire. The second, fifth, and the ninth go to France in 1940. But interestingly enough, they go as labour troops. The idea is that they'll go on the line of communication. They'll spend some of their time building roads, building railways, building depots, and that sort of thing, and the rest of their time catching up on their training until they're ready to go into the front line. When Germany attacks in France in May 1940, those labour divisions are rushed forward into the front line to try and plug the holes. And you've put the map up there. The Foresters are part of what's the 46th Division, which, as I say, it's not a fully trained division. It's not a fully equipped division, but it ends up in the front line. And it ends up in the front line fighting alongside the French. The canal line you see there, just south of a town called Wannes, which is south of Lille. The Sherwood Foresters fight there on the 26th of May. The Germans cross the canal, and once again, the Foresters are really outclassed by the trained German troops, and they're forced to fall back. 26th of May is also the date on which the BEF decides that it's going to evacuate from Dunkirk. And on that date, the Sherwood Foresters battalions are the furthest British troops from the Dunkirk beachhead. However, they also, in spite of the fact that they are these labor troops, they're not fully trained troops. They actually play quite an important role. They actually are at one point they are actually on the Dunkirk perimeter, fighting off the German attacks, and they're one of the very last battalions to leave. You see a picture there on a British destroyer. I don't know for certain, but it's quite possible that quite a number of those men are Sherwood Foresters, because that is the ship that took a lot of the Sherwood Foresters off on the night of the 1st and 2nd of June 1940.
How interesting. Yeah. And I mean, I go to Dover Castle quite a lot and see the exhibition there on, Operation Dynamo. And it was something,
Yeah.
yeah. And, Norway is something that in that time period you don't ever hear anything of. I've never really ever thought about it. I've only ever thought about Dunkirk in that little time period of,
Yeah.
May 1940. So, yeah, that's interesting. That's something new for me. I didn't know anything about that. Okay, so what kind of impact did those early defeats have on the 2nd, 5th Battalion, Mike?
It's interesting. I mean, you might think that morale would be very low after this. And certainly when they come back, I think the soldiers are a bit concerned that, how are the public going to treat them? Are they going to treat them as cowards? They're going to treat them as losers, sort of thing. Actually, the public reaction is very good. There's a lot of support for the troops as they arrive in Dover and the other ports on the south coast. The battalion reforms up in Manchester, and it's very well received by the people in Manchester. They go out their way to give them, beer in pubs and free haircuts and all sorts of things. So the response from the public to the army coming back is actually very positive. So I think that helps morale. The other interesting thing is reading some of their accounts is that they feel that they weren't given a fair chance. As I say, these people went out barely trained, armed just with rifles, and they're up against Stukas and tanks. And there's a very real feeling that give us the right tools and we can beat these guys. So from that point of view, morale, I think it was actually quite good once they've got over the original shock. And it's also interesting that I think on the previous slide you had some pictures of the unit training. And when I talk about those pictures, I often say these look a bit Dad's Army. Dad's Army is a World War II comedy series for those people who may never have heard of it, who probably don't live in Britain. And it does. It looks a bit amateurish, doesn't it? But they've left the army's left most of its equipment behind in France. So if you haven't got any trucks, you want to try and practice mobile warfare. What's the obvious thing to do? Well, you commandeer local buses. it looks amateurish, but actually it really makes a lot of sense. And the British Army is actually very good, I think, throughout history, improvisation and sort of this sort of amateur way of warfare, if you like.
Yeah. And again, that's what gets forgotten about Dunkirk is again, they pretty much left everything there. Or apart from the men, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. What an
And,
interesting picture.
yeah, and it influences the rest of the war because, for example, this is a second line battalion, if you like. The first people who get rearmed are obviously going to be the regulars. The next people who get rearmed are going to be the first line territorials. So these guys are at the bottom of the pecking order when it comes to being reorganized and rearmed. So keeping morale up in those circumstances is a very difficult job, and I think the officers of the battalion do a remarkable job in restoring morale, frankly.
Yeah. And also, I think that, and so this is going to get onto our next topic and their next location, but I also
Mm.
feel like sometimes North Africa is sort of forgotten about in that early part of the war, and that, there was that race there to get the canal, wasn't there?
Mm.
The Suez Canal.
Mhm.
And is that the one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. But again, I think it's been I don't think it's appreciated enough how involved Britain are in North Africa. And of course, our interests are there at the time. You've still got a sort of an empire going on. So, how do the Sherwood Foresters adapt to fighting in North Africa? And why is Tunisia campaign so often overlooked itself?
Um, yeah, so I think North Africa, I'm not sure I quite agree with you because I think North Africa on the whole, I think is talked about a lot in British military history. Um, but it does tend to focus a lot on Alamein, which is, it's that, well, Churchill says, before Alamein we never had victory, after Alamein we never had defeat. So he sets it up to be the big turning point. There's actually, I think that's a little bit unfair on a lot of the men and generals who fought in North Africa before that. It is really the only place in which we're fighting the German army for nearly 2 years. The two of the battalions of the Sherwood Foresters, the first battalion, which was in the Middle East at the beginning of the war, and the 14th, which is one of those wartime raised battalions, they do actually fight in the Western Desert. The first battalion fights in June 1942, and unfortunately, it gets involved in another one of those great British defeats, which is the loss of the book, where a lot of the men of the battalion are captured. Um, the 14th Battalion goes to the desert and they fight at the Battle of Alamein. So they've sort of broken that losing streak, if you like. But the second fifth battalion that I deal with goes to Tunisia, as you say. And Tunisia is completely unlike um, the Western Desert. If you can see in the bottom picture there, um, this is North Tunisia. It's hilly. It's much more like a European climate. It's in the winter, which is when they go there. They leave Britain on the Christmas Day, 1942. So this is January, February, March. So they're fighting. It's cold. It's wet. The hills are very rocky, so it's very difficult to dig foxholes. It really isn't it's not a pleasant place to be. And again, you've got to think about this is the first time these people have been away from UK ever, probably in most of their lives. It's certainly the first time they've been on any extended campaign. And it's going to be the first time that most of them are actually going to have actually been in combat. Um, so again, once again, a very difficult learning curve for these young men. And they are predominantly young, by the way. The boys who go to France in 1940, I've done some looking at some of the casualty lists, and the average age of the those who die in action is just over 20.
Mhm.
These are very young boys all the time.
Yeah, and how much? So when you put your books together, how much resources were available as far as letters and notebooks and things like that. Was you able to source that source material for
Yeah, so when
things
I
like that?
started, I thought, oh, it's going to be a question of getting the war diaries, and I thought it was going to be easy, quite honest. And then I spoke to the regimental archive, and I also discovered that in Nottinghamshire archive there was a very active battalion association, um, and the uh, secretary of the battalion association, when it finally wound up in 2005, a man called Waddy Bench, he had collected huge amounts of stories, photographs. He'd also arranged with the Imperial War Museum to do a lot of oral accounts, cassette tapes. So I have a huge number. I think there was about 150 men in the battalion who have left some form of account, and that ranges from a full biography of everything they did in the war down to little snippets of information about one particular incident. But yeah, huge amount of personal recollections of the war, and pulling all of those together with the official documentation. I think there's this sort of 360-degree view, if you like, of what the battalion was doing, which I'd like to think it's fairly unique. And I also, as I say, I looked at a lot of things like casualty lists and such like, to try and understand how some of the statistics worked. It's how old were these people? What were their backgrounds and things like that. Um, so the again, the Foresters' first experience of war in Tunisia is not brilliant because once again, this is an untrained battalion, and it ends up fighting against German paratroopers who are veteran troops. Field Marshal Harold Alexander said the troops that they were fighting were some of the best troops in Tunisia. So their first action is frankly a little bit of a disaster. Um, the battalion is heavily defeated. A significant number of the men are taken prisoner because the battalion gets surrounded. Just 12 days after that, they go into a second action, in which they try a counterattack, which is initially successful and then is beaten back. And then a third action in which, again, the Germans uh, start to surround them, but this time they manage to extricate themselves from the German pincer. Um, for reference, a battalion is about 750 men in fight, and probably only about two-thirds of those are actually fighting troops. You've got the drivers, cooks, signalers, all those sort of people who are essential parts of the battalion, but are not actually riflemen on the ground. Um, so during those 2 weeks of battle, the Foresters lose something like 500 casualties. So effectively, the whole frontline strength is killed. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everybody who started the combat is killed because they get reinforcements, replacements during that period. Um, but staggering numbers. We think about World War One in terms of this attritional warfare. Um, the frontline infantry units in World War Two take enormous casualties, and that's a theme that I'll come back to when we talk about Italy.
Yeah. Wow. That's yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? Um, and again, that's going to play into morale. Like, that's yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
so
so yeah, yeah.
go
So
on, carry on.
morale at the end of March 1942 is probably the lowest it ever reaches in the battalion, I suspect.
Hmm. And as you said, they're going to play a significant role in the Italian campaign. And I know obviously this is probably one of your favourite, parts that you got to research. Although again, probably wasn't one of their favourite parts to be involved in. But Mike, tell us about this, very long Italian campaign. 'Cause it's quite a long one, isn't it? And involved in some major engagements, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. So they don't play a role in Salerno. Salerno. They don't play a role in Sicily. But they're still part of 46th Division, and 46th Division is one of the formations which is landed at Salerno. And as again, the Italian campaign has tended to be forgotten about by most people these days. Um, we I was at the 80th commemoration of Salerno 2 years ago, well, yeah, 2023. And I went out there, and the British Embassy did put on you know a big effort to make sure that the forces were represented there and things like that. But if you compare that with what was done for the D-Day commemorations for the 80th of D-Day, it just pales into insignificance. There is no real recognition of the importance of the Salerno campaign in terms of this was the first time that British and American troops actually landed on mainland Europe. So again, 3 weeks of fighting, 250 casualties. Um, 2 weeks after that, the Foresters go to the River Volturno. Um, the River Volturno is the next German defensive line um, after Salerno, and there's a full-scale army attack on this. They're fighting. They're fighting under the American U.S. Fifth Army, in fact. So this is an Allied effort. It's not just a British effort. This is an Allied force which is involved. So they go across the Volturno. Again, they are attacked by some of the best German troops in Italy, by the 15th Panzer Division. Um, the River Volturno in October is in flood, so it's very difficult for them to get heavy weapons across. They can't get their anti-tank guns across. They slug it out with the 15th Panzer pretty much all day. Uh, but eventually they literally run out of things to fight back with. The barrels of things like the mortars and the machine guns are red hot, and they're just not going to work anymore. Um, so anyway, the picture there is actually Foresters again. This is a picture from the Imperial War Museum. Um, Propaganda picture, of course. This is German prisoners of war coming across from the initial attack. This is a staged photograph taken a couple of days after the battle. As I say, it's men of the Foresters in there, and they probably weren't too happy about taking this stage photograph, because once again, the battalion has taken something in the region of 200 casualties in this battle. Some of them captured, but if you're the wrong side of the river and you're being surrounded by the enemy, there's not very much you can do other than surrender. Um, the Foresters lose 5 out of 6 of their company commanders, killed or wounded or captured. They lose their commanding officer wounded. They lose their second in command wounded, and they lose the battalion adjutant, who's the sort of executive officer, captured. So huge losses in officers, and equally devastating losses in some of the companies as well, amongst the private soldiers and the NCOs. So by the end of October, there is only one battalion in Italy which has taken more casualties than the 5th Sherwood Foresters.
Wow. That's yeah.
And you were talking about morale.
Yeah.
My father joined them 3 days after that action on the Volturno. So you can imagine
Yeah.
what some of these reinforcements are coming in.
Now, you know, when it comes to reinforcements as well, they're probably looked on differently, aren't they? Because they haven't been through those same experiences that others have been through. So would that have been the case, do you think?
Yes, I mean, as I say, one of the things that I focus on is this whole question about turnover of people in the battalion. So when the battalion goes to Tunisia, it is very much still a Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire battalion. Um, Again, I've tried to do some analysis based upon casualty lists, because it's very difficult. Other than casualty lists, you don't tend to get any evidence about who the private soldiers serving in a battalion are. And I think something like 70 or 80% of the soldiers, again, this is in American terms, it's the enlisted men, it's the privates and the NCOs. Something like 70, 80% of those were initially recruited or volunteered for the Sherwood Foresters. By the time you get to Salerno, with all of those casualties, only about 30 to 40% of the men are originally Sherwood Foresters. So my father was not originally a Sherwood Forester. He was originally recruited into something called the General Service Corps. He was then assigned to another county regiment called the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment. And it's only when he goes to Italy and actually goes into the front line that he's then assigned to the Foresters. Um, Assimilating those people is again is absolutely key. Some battalions I think do it well, some battalions do it not so well. Um, and again, I think it's a tribute to the officers of the battalion that they do seem to be able to keep the battalion operating at quite a high level of performance, in spite of this continual churn of people and people coming in who are not necessarily from, they don't necessarily have the regimental background and the regimental ethos behind them.
Wow, really good. Fascinating story. Tell us about the winter line, Mike. What's up?
Yeah. So my father often talked about Monte Cassino, which is the one name in Italy, I think, which does have popular recognition. It's a name that people do recognise. If you look at British accounts of the Battle of Monte Cassino, you will not find any reference to 46th Division or the Sherwood Foresters, because they don't take part in the actual battles which are around the Cassino Monastery. However, they do take part in what was in the American operations just south of Cassino. There's an initial operation at Monte Camino, which is the picture at the bottom there. I talked about rain in Tunisia. Most of us go to Italy if we've been there on holiday. We go June, July, August, September when it's nice and sunny. The Apennine Mountains in November, December, January, February are horrible. You can see the rain here. If you're higher up in the hills, this is snow. It's a dreadful place to fight during the winter. And the Germans, of course, take full advantage of this. So let's not diminish the fact that the Germans are very, very good troops, and with very skilled commanders at all levels of the army. They know exactly how to prepare a position. You've got continual river lines, which they are able to defend. You've got mountain lines, which they're able to defend. And it's a slogging match. It's attritional warfare, not exactly like the First World War, because you don't have those continuous trench lines. But in scale of casualties, it's not very dissimilar. And in the conditions in which men have to fight, it's not very dissimilar, quite frankly, as well. The first Battle of Cassino, which is the attack by the Texan Division across the River Rapido, quite a notorious action in American military history. It was a very bloody defeat for the the Texans. The Foresters are actually fighting literally alongside them. There is a small German outpost, the wrong side of the river, i.e. the American side of the river, which the Foresters take out on the day of the American attack. The only secondary history that I've actually seen that in is in the official US Fifth Army history. It's not mentioned at all in British histories, but it's in the official US Fifth Army history. The Foresters are pulled out middle of February. The last thing they see is the bombing of the monastery. And again, by that time, about 750 casualties. I can't remember the exact number. So, again, in numerical terms, the equivalent of an entire battalion has been lost in 4 months.
Wow, staggering. Okay, and again, I think, like you said, sort of the Italian campaign, I don't think people realise how brutal it was. And I think, would you say it's because that's where the best German troops are at that point in time, would you say?
It is where the British and the Americans are fighting the Germans. I mean, I wouldn't like to say that the German troops are necessarily better than, say, the German troops who are fighting in Russia. but there are some very good troops. The terrain is particularly well suited to defence. And yeah, there's yeah, it's definitely a very, very difficult task. Um, and again, there's a learning curve here because we talked about Salerno. All all three divisions which land at Salerno, both the two English divisions and the American division, it's the first time they've ever fought together in combat. The 46th Division did fight in Tunisia, but it never fought as a single division. It fought very split up for reasons we've not gone into. So all the time, Mark Clark, the American commander, he's never commanded an army. He's, all throughout the army, people are having to learn. So there's a very steep learning curve here going on in Italy. And it's those lessons in Italy that enable the campaign in Northwest Europe to be so successful, in my view.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Obviously, learning here is going to harden them all up, isn't it? Yeah, definitely. Okay, what about the Gothic line? Let's talk about that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Foresters are pulled out in February, and they go to the Middle East. They go to Palestine and Syria to retrain, basically. Um, they come back probably at their most effective. There's several people who say, whose accounts say that we finally had a chance to get together, take stock, get the we talked about the morale, getting people to work together, getting really building a battalion ethos and an understanding between the officers and the NCOs and the men. Um, so when they come back to Italy, which is in July 1944, it's that I think they're probably the most effective that they are ever going to be. The Gothic line is in the northern Apennines. So Rome falls 2 days before the landings in Normandy. Rome falls, so it doesn't get the headlines for very long, but it's quite an important event. It's the first capital of the fascist powers to fall. The Gothic line, as I say, is the main German defensive, the last German defensive line in Italy. It's been being prepared for a year or so by now. It's not the Atlantic Wall. Let's be quite honest about that. But again, the nature of the Italian terrain means that it is still very formidable. The map there is what's called a defence overlay. So this is the British intelligence map showing where all the machine gun positions and things are. And just to give you an understanding of scale, those squares are 1 kilometre squares, so they're 100, they're 1,000 yard squares. Belvedere Folienza, which is at the middle, roughly in the middle of the map, that's the Foresters' objective on the 30th of August. The top picture there is what Belvedere Folienza looks like. It is literally a medieval fortress. Now, okay, that's the southern wall. There are entrances around the sides, but it is a really tough position to take. Foresters take it on the morning of the 31st in roughly 1.5 square kilometers on that map. They win 7 major gallantry awards, three of which are won by one platoon. The Hampshire, and this is true of all of the battalions which are attacking here on the forest and on the Gothic line. The Leicestershire Regiment attacks on the left flank of the Foresters. The Hampshire Regiment attacks on some Hampshire battalions attack on the right flank of the Foresters. Between the four assaulting battalions, there are something something in the order of 30 major gallantry awards, including a Victoria Cross. I have a bit of a bias on here. Um, if this was a Normandy beach, we would have heard about that, but it's not a Normandy beach, so it's been forgotten. But there are some incredible acts, both of bravery and of technical capability, taking this position with us, and they don't actually take that many casualties taking this position. It is a remarkable achievement, and it's mostly done by the British infantry.
Wow. Yeah, again, not a lot of people hear about all this, do they? Because, like you
Mm.
said, D-Day takes over.
Yes,
And at this
very much
point,
so.
the German army's really stretched, isn't it? I mean, it's having a real slogging fest in the east as
Yeah.
well as having to deal with like you said, the Allied troops landing in Normandy, and of course losing all this ground in Italy. So they're really stretched at this point, I suppose, as
It
well.
is, and
But
you can say, ah, yes, but you're not fighting the top quality German troops. You're not
yeah,
fighting, the SS divisions that were fighting in Normandy,
yeah,
and that is true. I accept that, but at the same time, you can only beat what's in front of you.
hmm
Um, and generally speaking, the Allied troops in Italy are successful in beating what's in front of them. The problem is that you never get that great breakthrough, and really the problem with that is partly because they don't have the unlimited resources or relatively unlimited resources because they're all going into Northwest Europe. But also what we talked earlier about the fact that Italy is just a horrible place to fight. I mean, the picture at the bottom there is in mid to late September. That is, the rains come down in September in Italy. It's an unusual month, I think. Um, but the conditions in Italy when you have bad weather are just dreadful. This is certainly the equivalent of Flanders mud. And unlike Northwest Europe, Italy doesn't have the transport infrastructure. You can see on this map where are the roads. Frankly, there really aren't any. In some places, there aren't even mule tracks. Um, so the conditions and trying to fight a mechanized war under these circumstances, which is what the Allies are trying to fight, is incredibly difficult. And that has to be taken into account when you're considering the difficulty of the military operations.
yes. Okay. And why was the fighting in Italy so brutal for the infantry units? And again, that's pretty much you've answered the question there. You know,
Well, as I say, it's a combination of things. You've got very difficult terrain. You've either got mountains or you've got river systems. Even when you get onto the Po Valley and onto the plains, there's a navigation ditch every few miles. The position on the picture on the left there is the scene of the Foresters' last action. It's a very small ditch in terms of width, but it's 10 foot deep. You can't get a tank across that. And so all you need to do is blow up the bridges or crater the roads, and a lot of the Allied armour is just immobilised for any practical purposes until you can get the engineers up. The Germans are very good at sighting anti-tank guns. They're very good at sighting tanks in concealed positions. They've become very good at hit and run tactics with their artillery. You fire a few harassing rounds and then you pull them out before the overwhelming British bombardments and American bombardments can come down. As I say, let's be quite clear. The Germans are very, very good, even when they haven't got very much left, and they take full advantage of the geographic and meteorological advantages that they get.
okay, Mike. So, obviously D-Day happens, and how did the soldiers react to the being labelled the D-Day Dodgers?
Well, I understand that one of the reactions was which D-Day,
Mhm.
because Normandy has hijacked the term D-Day. Every single amphibious landing had a D-Day.
Yes,
But now if you talk about D-Day, oh, that's Normandy.
yes,
But there was a D-Day at Salerno, there was a D-Day at in Sicily, there was a D-Day at Anzio, which we sort of didn't talk very much about Anzio. Um, so I think that there's certainly a feeling that lack of recognition for their efforts is certainly one potential um, reaction. Um, Having said that, there's also it is a morale boost in some ways because it's taking the war that stage further, and there is a feeling certainly that the war is coming to an end. We're one step. We are going to win this thing. But the problem then, of course, becomes okay. So we're going to win this thing. We're a secondary theatre. Am I really going to stick my neck out and get myself killed? So there are a number of studies about morale in Italy in the closing months of the war, and it is again it is a problem. Um, I have to say that I've not got any direct because I'm very focused on looking at a battalion level history, and I have been very strict on myself that I've not gone to other areas to try and get other first-hand accounts. The Foresters leave Italy at the end of November 1944. So they don't go through another Italian winter. They have an interesting winter somewhere else. Um, so they don't really have that sort of final, if you like, the morale thing about, is this all really worth it? Why am I sacrificing myself for, as I say, a sideshow, if you like. Um, so arguably they go to an even bigger sideshow and an even less well-recognized sideshow, which is Greece. This is one of the few pictures that I have of my father actually in uniform. That's in Athens, I think in about February 1942. Um, Not many people know this, but Greece is the only place that British and well, Allied troops actually fight communist armed insurrection. She only they go to fight those guys at the bottom there who are Greek partisans who've kicked the Nazis out, but they're communist partisans and they don't want the old uh, royalist government to come back, which is what the British support, who the British support. They want to take over the country and turn it into something like Bulgaria or Yugoslavia, a communist regime. Um, so this is very much more like a peacekeeping mission. It's very much more like the sort of thing that we would do, in modern times in Iran or Iraq or in the former Yugoslavia. And it very much sets the tone for the Cold War. There is actual fighting. There is actual fighting in Athens, street fighting in Athens. The Foresters are up in the north of Greece, where it is much more a policing operation. Um, but again, I argue that this is actually one of the most important episodes because it, why the whole strategy, particularly Churchill's strategy for the Mediterranean, was in part not only to defeat the Germans, but in part to try and anticipate what the post-war world was going to be like, and that standoff. He anticipated that standoff between the communists and what would become NATO, the Western Allies. Um, so I actually argue that this is really the start of the Cold War and a very important operation which we tend to have forgotten about.
Yeah, I'd never even heard of it. I mean, I assumed the Germans were there, and that's why they went there. I didn't know that it was because of the partisans. That's interesting. Yeah.
The Germans occupied Greece in 1941, and that was quite a big problem for us because it blocked naval transport through the Mediterranean. But yeah, in late 1944, partly because of the partisans, but also because of pressure in Italy, the Germans have to move troops out of the Balkans into Italy, which means that Greece, Yugoslavia, and these other Balkan countries are easier for the partisans to push the Germans out. So we were saying that there is no decisive victory in Italy, but it has important repercussions. The Italian campaign has important repercussions, which again I think people tend to forget about.
Yeah. Some really good points. How important was the regimental pride, Mike?
Um, Absolutely critical. I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
we sort
Like
of
any.
touched on
Yeah.
it a bit. We sort of touched on it a bit. Um, I mean, if you think about the war as a whole, so we talked about the formation of the recruitment for the regiment. Um, that whole regional, not county pride, county loyalty. That's very important in terms of trying to get people to enlist in 1939, 1940. They. the the second battalion, which is the regular battalion, that does a number of sort of county fairs, if you like, around the county, showing off, the latest equipment and things like that. The Duke of Devonshire, who's the biggest landowner in the county, is very, very supportive of the regiment. There's a lot of call and reference to the sacrifice that the regiment made in World War One and the casualties that they took in World War One. So that initial recruitment is very important. Some of the regiment, like we talked about the 8th Foresters who went to Norway, when the 8th Foresters actually are turned into a training unit in 1942, but a lot of the men who fought in Norway, the army is quite sensitive to this whole question, and a lot of the men who leave the 8th Battalion are sent to the 2nd, 5th Battalion. So they are people are kept within the regiment. There's also, if you are a good officer, you will try and instill your men with a sense of unit identity, unit pride, not just at the regimental level, but at the battalion level, at the company level, maybe even at the platoon level. So things like competitive sports, and even competition, shooting competitions, all of these sort of things, they're immensely important in trying to instill a sense of pride in your unit. So this again is one of the things that when troops are out of the front line, it's very difficult to do it when you're in the front line, for obvious reasons. But when you're out of the front line, one of the first things you try and do is to get people not training individually, but training as a unit. And again, this was one of the big things in Palestine, and it's also one of the big things in Greece, because the expectation is that, okay, you've got this policing operation in Greece, but eventually we're going to go back and fight Germany again.
Yeah. Okay then. So by 1945, what kind of legacy would you say the Sherwood Forest had earned at that point?
Um, I'm not sure I'm not sure how I'd answer that question in some ways. I mean, I closed the second volume of the book, which is not published yet. It's going to come out in June, which is really covering the Italian campaign. Um, I'm not going to try and pretend that this is an elite unit, and in some respects that's the whole point of the book, is that we spend a lot of time focused on the paratroops or the commandos and people like that who are elite units. They are incredibly highly trained, incredibly capable, but they're not the average British soldier. The average British soldier is the people in the count is the chap in the county regiment. And some of the things they do and some of the things they're called on to do are no less extraordinary. I will give you one example, and it touches on a couple of things we've talked about. At the Gothic line, one of the platoons is pinned down. It's only got 3 rounds of ammunition left, and it's pinned down by a machine gun in a house. A lad volunteers to go and take this machine gun out. He's not yet 20 years old. No, sorry, he's 20. He is 20 years old. He's just short of his 21st birthday. And he goes forward, and he does take out the machine gun. He kills one German and he captures 2 others, I think it is. He wins the military medal, and his military medal citation says that he does this with a bayonet. There is an account in the archive that I told you about by his platoon commander. His platoon commander says he did it with a pocket knife. Now, that is he is not a paratrooper. He's not a member of the SAS. He's not a commando. He is a 20-year-old heavy metal worker from Chesterfield. He is an ordinary person, and he will never talk about that to his family. How can you?
Mm.
So
Incredibly brave.
It's incredibly brave, but at the same time, Des, it is incredibly brutal.
Yes.
It is and I can't comprehend it. And he does this. People ask why do men fight? He does this essentially because he wants to preserve his life and the life of his mates in his platoon. It is about that. It is at the end of the day, a lot of the reason that people fight is not for the country, not for some ideological reason, but because it's about you and your mates and keeping your mates alive.
Yeah. And that's
But
something
there
you
are
see in most wars, I think.
It is absolutely every war. It's
Yeah.
true of it is true of the of every army and every war. The one thing that almost everybody in the battalion talks about, and I'm going to sort of say the legacy of the regiment or the battalion to me is its veterans. The one thing that they all talk about is that intense male companionship because you have to trust some these other people in the unit with your life effectively.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So
No, brilliant answer. Thank you. Um, okay, let's talk about peacetime. And so they end up doing some peace missions, I believe. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so again, so because they go back to Italy, but they never actually fight again in Italy, because the war basically outruns them. They're heading up north through Italy when the German troops in Italy surrender. They surrender on the 2nd of May, which is a few days before the official VE Day. They go into the army. They go into Austria as an army of occupation. Austria again is a strange post-war environment. Austria was part of the Third Reich, but it's considered to be the first of Hitler's victims because Hitler took Austria over in 1938. But there are Nazis in Austria, and there is a level of denazification which has to take place. There are huge numbers of troops of German troops that have to be disarmed and rounded up. There are huge numbers of displaced persons. So these are not refugees in the sense we see them these days, where they've been bombed out of their houses. These are people that have been transferred across Europe in order to go and work for the Nazis. So people from France, people from Italy, people from all sorts of places, Poland. They're working in German and Austrian factories. So all of these things have to be considered. It's an administrative nightmare, frankly. Um, there's another big complication, or two big complications in Austria because of what we talked about the Cold War. Back in 1945, you now have a nice, clear, distinct border between Austria and Slovenia. The populations back in 1945 are actually quite intermixed. There are Slovenians living in southern Austria. There are Germans living in northern Slovenia. The Yugoslavs don't want Germans in their country anymore, but they would quite like those bits of Austria which have got Slovenes in them. So there's a lot of tension with the Yugoslav with Tito's Yugoslav partisans. There are some 30,000 Russians who were fighting for Hitler. These are Cossacks. So you can say, well, they were fighting for Cossack independence, but they've been fighting with the SS. And they are rounded up and handed over to the to the Red Army. It's post war. It was it became very controversial because effectively you're handing these people over pretty much to their deaths. They would have ended up either being executed straight away or going off to the Gulag. Um, but it's it was a very efficiently carried out operation from the Foresters' point of view, but it was also something which people said was one of the most distasteful things they ever did. Because I think most people realise that the fate of these men was not going to be good. And eventually, the battalion is wound down. One of the comments again that people make about the Cossacks is, yeah, it was really distasteful, but frankly, we were fed up with war and we just wanted to go home. And you can really sort of imagine that. The main concern of most of the men in the battalion by the second half of 1945 is when am I going to get demobilized? And gradually the people in the battalion are demobilized. Um, the battalion finishes off in southern Styria. That picture on the bottom right is on the Austrian Yugoslav border. It's probably the last photograph that was ever taken of pictures of men in the battalion. By that time, there's about 400 men and about 20 officers, and less than half of those people had actually fought in the war.
Wow.
So again, the battalion is continually changing. We sometimes, I think, in military history, we tend to think of battalions as chess pieces. They're not. They are living organisms. Which is why I subtitled my book "The Biography of a Battalion," because although there are lots of characters in the book, the real character is the battalion itself and how it changes and how it develops.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, I think people forget that, they think that World War II finishes after, D-Day, not D-Day, sorry, VE Day on
Mm.
May the 8th, but technically it doesn't, does it? It's going to go on for ages to get all this, like you said, people, displaced people, and everything's
Yeah.
been destroyed, and everything that everyone knows is just never going to be the same again. And so, I don't know
But
what I can't imagine what it's like for these guys being sitting there waiting to be told to go home.
Mm. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And again, we've touched on morale in various different circumstances, but morale again is a big problem. We have this term demob happy, and that really is the problem. If you're going to be demobilized in a month's time, what's the point of obeying orders? What's the point of army discipline anymore? Um, and interesting enough, again, as I said, one of the things I've tried to do is to look at some of the what to many people would be rather boring records like casualty lists and things. One of the things I looked at was court martials, and there are an extraordinary number of court martials immediately post-war, more than there are during the war itself. And some of these people who are court-martialed are people who've won gallantry medals, but then they get court-martialed for talking back to an officer or firing a weapon. There's one guy who demonstrates a captured Italian semi-automatic pistol by shooting it out of a window, and he gets court-martialed for sort of reckless endangerment of personnel. But these are, as I say, there's a military medal winner who is court-martialed for going AWOL, I think it is. So discipline again is and morale in the post-war world it's another problem for the officers to have to think about and the army to have to think about, and it is something they do think about very strongly. How do we prepare these men for peace is actually a question that the army does ask itself in terms of the training program and things like that it gives to people.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's talk about yourself, Mike, because like you said, you've done two books, and then the volume two is coming out on June the 30th.
Yes.
But tell us about your. So when did the first one come out, Mike?
So the first volume came out at the end of November. So the first volume takes the battalion from its birth, which is basically the end of March 1939, through to the end of the Tunisian campaign. Um, and then the second volume starts with Salerno, and it takes it through to what we've talked about, the post-war period, and also the story of some of the people, in later life. So I mentioned this archive. There's the secretary of the association is a man called Waddy Bench, and in the 70s, 80s, he started to get these veterans together, and they got together in reunions in pubs, and then dinner dances and things like that. But he also took them over to back to the places where they'd fought. Um, so incredible collection of reminiscences, without which I wouldn't have been able to write this. So I feel that in part I should almost have put him as a co-author on some of this. Um, but yeah, there's a lot. There's a sort of a coda, if you like, to what did these people do after the war, and what impact did the war have on them as well. So the two books, and I think they are sort of standalone, so you can just read the first one if you've got ancestors or your interest is in North Africa. You're not so interested in the Italian campaign. The Italian book does sort of have a very brief introduction, which talks about the battalion, the battalion up to the landing in Salerno. So if your ancestors fought or your relatives fought just in Italy, you have the option of just buying the second volume. But I would hope that a lot of people might give both volumes a chance, because I think it then gives you that complete story which we've talked about end to end, in terms of what was it like throughout the war for an ordinary infantry battalion.
Yeah, brilliant.
And
And
the website, sherwoodboys.co.uk. There's various material on the website which is sort of additional to the book. So there's a lot of photographs of members of the battalion. There's some additional stuff on some of the battles in terms of orders of battle and maps. And there's also there's a lot of very detailed notes which I felt were too intrusive to go into the books. But if people really want to follow up and understand where some of the information comes from in the book, there are some much more detailed notes on the website as well. And I've also got, as you've also got on there, I've got a Facebook page on which I post little short stories, and this is about really about the individuals. So on the anniversary of significant events, I will post a little story about an individual in the battalion. I've got quite a lot of people who are associated with the regiment, or again whose relatives served in the war, who are following me on there. So I'm slowly building up a small following on there, and I would welcome anybody to have a look and follow it. It's also, if you've got any questions you can contact me through either of those two, either the website or the Facebook page.
well, thank you. And I'll make sure there is a link in the podcast description, so don't worry about that. But
Much
all that is
appreciated.
left to say at this point, Mike, is thank you very much for coming on and telling us about the Sherwood Boys, and thank you so much. It was a fascinating topic to listen to and to learn about. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. Oh, I believe you have some American listeners, so I could add one little American angle on this. Is that, as one does these days, when you're doing this research, you go on Google, don't you? And you Google Sherwood Foresters, and I discovered there's a reenactment group for the Sherwood Foresters, specifically for the 5th Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters.
Nice.
And they are based in Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that. I thought you were going to say the UK. Yeah. There you go.
So if there's anybody in the Memphis area, get in touch with these guys. They're really good. There's a little blog on my website about them. So yeah. So
Have they all joined your Facebook group?
I'm not sure if they have yet, but
Well, they need to. I'm telling them.
I think they ought to. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But honestly, Mike, all that is left to say at this point, mate, is thanks and cheers.
Thank you very much, Des. Thanks for your time.